Hi, my name is Fern, and I am going to be your host today for the Making Mozzarella workshop with Christy Bassett. And before we begin, I want to first welcome everybody to the conference. And we're going to put up some slides and talk a little bit about what's going on and how the workshop's going to go. And we'll go from there. Let's see. Also, Jessie is our she's helping me as well. So if you have any questions or anything like that, you could do to everybody and one of us will probably answer. Okay, so here's how we start this off. Whoops. There you go. So we're sharing a few links here. Hang on a second. Before we jump in, I have some details to review. This is our land acknowledgements map. It's an interactive map that can be found. Maybe Jesse, you can drop the link in there. At this link, we are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose lands you can now occupy. We will make every effort to get questions to have answered during the workshop. Just use the chat feature to comment or ask questions during the workshop. Pose your question to the presenter throughout the session. To speak, simply click the microphone icon on the bottom of your screen. Please mute yourself when you are done speaking to avoid background noise. And to save the chat, to the right of the chat box, there are 3 dots with extra actions. Click the 3 dots and select Save Chat, and it will download to your computer, probably into your download file. Okay, a few more slides here. We're going to ask you to stay muted. Please mute yourself when you are done speaking to avoid background noise and interfering with other speakers. Feel free to use the chat feature to comment on any point during the workshop. And like I said, we'll be checking that periodically. And please note that this is being recorded. Yep. There we go. We have lots of amazing sponsors who keep these conferences going for the last 50 years. So take a look here and please do what you can to support them. Maybe we can drop in the vendor marketplace link, if you wouldn't mind, Jesse. And these are our other ones. So please do what you can to support them either locally or online in any way possible. That would be terrific. There you go. And we have virtual vendors and vendor presentations. So again, please take a look. All of this stuff you can also find in your program book. And we have a link for that too. And we have, that's it. We also do have an auction. I'm going to stop the screen sharing here for a minute. We have an auction and you can find all the information there as well. And we'll drop that into the link as well for the auction. Excuse me. I'll just grab this drink. Let's see. I think we've got everything. Yes. If anybody has any questions, just let us know. So as I said, we're going to be making mozzarella, learn how to make fresh, melty, stretchy mozzarella cheese at home. And our presenter is Christy Bassett. She's a homesteader from Barre, Mass. With a focus on dairy animals. Hand milks a small herd of mini, how do you say that? Saanen? Saanen dairy goats and their family milk cow Shine each day. Christy's worked hard as a cheesemaker at various farmstead creameries in Central Mass and takes pride in providing locally sourced homemade food for her family. Take it away.
Thank you, Fern. Hi, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces out there. So I'm going to just run through a quick intro, and I have a little demo video that I'm going to hopefully show you. Hopefully it works. To speed through the process just to get you familiar with what it's like. and then we're gonna do a live demo. So I'm curious if anyone is planning on joining me in making mozzarella live tonight. If you are, you can speak up. Or if not, I'll be on my own and I'll try not to mess it up, and you guys can do it later when no one's watching. All right. So let me just run through the things that you may need. Okay. So you've decided you want to make mozzarella and you're really excited and you want to make the stuff on the right that is really fancy looking. That's a homemade braided mozzarella rope. That was delicious and really fun to make, but you need a lot of milk for that. But once you get good at it, you can do bigger and bigger batches and get fancy like that. So to start with, you need some milk. This is just a 1 gallon recipe. I typically make 4-gallon batch recipes just to use up the milk from our animals. But 1 gallon is a really good way to start. It should yield you plenty of mozzarella to use for a meal for a medium-sized family or make a big pizza. I'm gonna do a quick mozzarella recipe tonight, which is using citric acid as the acidifier. There are different ways that you can make mozzarella. You can use a lactic acid set, which is using the natural acids in the milk and some thyme, or you can use culture. But this is a pretty easy, steady way to make mozzarella with the citric acid. I use a non-GMO citric acid that you can get from a cheese supply source or online. And you'll need some rennet. I use a vegetable-based non-GMO coagulant, which is, it's a synthetic rennet, but some people prefer not to use animal-based rennet, which is made from calves that go through the food system. For equipment, you're just going to need a big pot. A slotted spoon is really helpful. This is actually a cheese making spoon there on the left. A knife, an extra spoon, a thermometer. You can use gloves if you want to use your hands on the really hot, melty stuff, which is kind of fun. I prefer just to use the spoon until it's manageable and use my bare hands, but you can definitely use gloves if you are interested in getting right in there. An extra strainer and a bowl. The basic process, you're going to make sure you dissolve your rennet into some water, dissolve your citric acid into the water, make sure those are really well dissolved. And I'm actually going to do that now. If you're interested in looking at the demo, there is a separate screen for that labeled demo here. So you can look through your gallery view to find that, or just keep an eye on that if it's not front and center. So this recipe, I'm going to use 1 1/4 teaspoons of citric acid. Some recipes call for 1 1/2 teaspoons of citric acid per gallon of milk, but I found that to be a little bit too much. So I like the 1 1/4 ratio. And I'm also going to start heating up my milk. So we're going to heat the milk to about 90 degrees. Then we'll add our rennet. We'll let it set and coagulate. We'll cut that curd, heat it up a little bit more, get it nice and ready for the next stage. Then we'll take the curds out of the whey and we'll heat that whey up to around 160 or 170 degrees. And then once it gets there, we'll add the curds to the hot whey and get them ready to stretch. Okay, so here we are at a little over 90 degrees, adding the rennet to the milk, which had the citric acid already in it. The rennet is going to be stirred in really well, and we give it some time to coagulate, about 3 to 5 minutes. I'm gonna check for a clean break. So you can use a knife, you could use your finger. Just make sure that milk is now coagulated, and we're gonna cut the curd. So a nice long knife is good for this. Just wanna make even slices as best you can. Maybe 1/2 inch wide or so. Eventually you wanna cut this up into small cubes. So you can see we go vertically one way and then horizontally the other. And that's going to give you some nice thin columns. And once the columns have been made, you can go diagonally and sideways and just want to cut them into small chunks. And then we're going to heat them so that some of the whey comes out of the curd. So you're separating the curds from the whey. And the smaller those curds are, the faster they will have the whey cooked out of them. So you can kind of use your judgment on how small you want them to be, what your temperature is on the stove. But we're just making sure we get any big globs broken down a little bit. And you can see the curds that are on the bottom of the pan on the heat have already started to cook and stretch and melt. So it might have been a good idea to take it off the heat for that part. But basically you're gonna make sure they're cut, heat them up a little bit. And you can see the curds are starting to mat together, which is a good sign after about 10 minutes. We're gonna keep heating until we get to around 110 degrees, and then remove our curds from the whey. If you leave them in the whey, they can acidify because there's still citric acid in there and there's still lactic acid in there. And the longer you leave it in there, the more acidic your curds will get, and that can lead to problems stretching if their pH changes too much. So we'll take them out. Some people use water at this point, so they may have had a pot of water heating up to the correct temperature, and then they could just go right to that step next. But I figure my whey is already there, and I'm already heating it, so I may as well just use that for the next step. All right, so now our whey has been heated up to at least 160 degrees, but we don't really want it to be too high. So I usually like it around 160 to 170. Turn that heat way down so it doesn't continue to get too hot. And you can see I've taken the curds and broken that into 2 balls. So as they were sitting in the strainer, they were dripping away into a bowl that was underneath it, and they're continuing to mat together over there. So I just took my hands and broke it into 2 balls. And then we're gonna put those curds into the whey as you saw and start heating them up. And we want those curds to get to an internal temperature of about 135 degrees to stretch properly. Once you get a feel for what that looks like, you won't have to measure the temperature. You can just kind of tell it's at the right point for stretching. It's also a little hard to measure because it's melty and your thermometer is squishing through into the whey and then it's out of the whey too long, and you have to get a quick read and then use your judgment. So that looks pretty good. We're close to the stretching point here. If you leave it on the bottom of the pot unattended, you can see it's already dripping and melting through the slotted spoon. So that bottom is getting a little too hot, but I wanted the top to get a little warmer before we stretch that glob. So we're just about there. It's hard to get it even. Try to keep it from melting over the sides. You don't want to work it too much. The more you try to stretch and squeeze those curds, the tougher it's going to be. So you want a nice tender, stretchy, melty mozzarella. And we don't want to work with it too much because then you lose some of that elasticity. All right, so there it is, prime stretching. You want to work pretty quickly because it is going to cool off quickly outside of the way. So we'll take it out and put it on a plate or another surface where you can work with it. Here's the point where you can salt. I had the salt pre-measured, so for a gallon of milk, usually you want around 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And that should be a sea salt or another version of non-iodized salt, mostly because that can affect the flavor of your cheese and also the ability for your acid to work properly. So it's cooling off. I'm going to heat it up again there to make sure that I can stretch that piece of curd and get the salt incorporated. If you don't use salt, you're going to have a really bland cheese that's really not going to have a lot of flavor. It is hard to make sure that you salt properly. I probably, if I wasn't doing this for the camera, would have used a pinch of salt and kind of dispersed it better than the clump there. So once your salt is dispersed and you've stretched it out, you can form it into a ball or pretty much whatever shape you like. It is gonna kind of melt into a flat ball if you just do what I did in that last frame there, which is fine for most things. Even if you wanted to just leave it that way and put it in the refrigerator, you could cut it later, or you could shred it later, or you could even put it, in the middle of a serving plate that way. For the second piece, you can see there's some nice stretching there. That's what you're looking for. Again, a little heavy on the salt there. Ideally, you want to try to get it more evenly dispersed and on both sides. For this second piece, I'm going to show you a couple of different options for shapes that you might want to make out of your mozzarella. Ideally with the stretching also, you want to not see any tearing. If your cheese tears, then, it's not quite at the right temperature, or the pH is a little bit off. All right, so one of my kids' favorite things is string cheese. And you probably have all had string cheese from the store. This is just mozzarella stretched into a straight line. You can make it any length that you want, which is kind of fun. Sometimes we make ropes of 10-foot long mozzarella strings, and then we cut them. It is a little hard to keep them uniform when they're homemade, but that's part of the attraction. So once you have the shape that you want, put them into salted ice water to help them cool down fast and retain their shape, not to continue melting and getting flat on the surface. If you don't use salt in your ice water bath, the water will suck out your salt and you'll lose a lot of flavor. So make sure that water is fully saturated or has enough salt in it that it's not going to pull out the salt you want to keep. The other thing that's kind of fun to make are little pearls or mozzarella balls, which you have probably had or seen. So you just cut a small piece, roll it in your hands, put it in the salt water, ice water, help it preserve that shape quickly. Those are really good for caprese salad, or you can put them in marinated olive oil and put them on salads. You can really impress your friends if you bring homemade mozzarella balls to a barbecue. And the fun part is when you have just a little bit left, as the cook, you get to have the leftovers. Sometimes if you stretch it too thin too, like you can see I did there, mostly just to show you that it's starting to tear a little, so and that middle section is not quite warm enough. So not ideal for keeping, but great for tasting. You could also adjust your salt level here if you taste it and it seems not quite salty enough. Or if it's too salty, you could also put it in boiling water, maybe not boiling, but hot water to draw some of the salt out and get it to the right amount. So here is our string cheese cooled. You can see it peels perfectly, just like the store-bought string cheese. And kids love that. The mozzarella balls, they're gonna peel also. So once they're cold, they're not going to stretch, but you can heat them back up if you wanted to. Okay, I'm gonna stop there for now. We'll come back and watch this little extra bonus piece at the end. But my milk over here, the live demo, is a little over 90 degrees. So I'm ready to add my rennet. I'm gonna do that. When you add the rennet, you don't really want to stir really hard. You don't want to add extra air in there, but you do want to make sure that you disperse the rennet evenly, because if it kind of clumps in one spot, you'll have coagulation in one area and milk in another. So just kind of swirl your slotted spoon around. And you can see on the demo screen, there's some coagulation already starting. So it acts pretty fast. I have the heat down low because we're going to continue heating just a little bit. And while it's setting, it can go up to 110 degrees or so. So we'll just wait a few minutes. Are there any questions while we're waiting?
Yeah.
Hi. Oh, you got it, Desi? Okay, go ahead.
Well, actually, Fern had the question about do you keep adding the ball to the water to keep it stretchy?
The hot water.
Yeah, so you can use hot water or you can use the hot way, but yeah, so as you're in the stretching stage, if it's not quite stretching right, or you salted it and then you want to change the shape of it, you just dip it back in the hot way to heat it back up.
Great. Another question from somebody: I have rennet in the refrigerator. Do I sit it on the counter before I use it? What kind of rennet and where do you purchase it?
Yeah, good question. You can get rennet from any cheese making supply company. And There's New England Cheese Making Supply. There's one called Get Culture, the Dairy Connection. There are plenty of them out there if you just do a Google search, but there are different types of rennet I mentioned. So there's animal rennet that comes either in a powder form or a tablet form. I think it probably comes in a liquid too, although I have never purchased it. And there's the vegetable-based coagulant. So you can get single strength, double strength, triple strength, all different strengths of rennet. So it's important to look and see how much rennet you should be using, how much for your recipe, so what it calls for, and that should be labeled on the bottle. So what I used was a double strength coagulant. So I need to use about half as much as I would if I was using a single strength. It is good to keep it in the refrigerator. If you have tablets, you can keep them in the freezer. But when you take it out and you mix it into your water, it doesn't really matter if it's right from the refrigerator or it has been set out. So I'm gonna hold that thought and I'm gonna check my my cut for the curd to see if there's a clean break. So it looks like not yet. You can see there's some coagulation happening. I just turned up the heat a little because we have to get to 110. Were there other questions?
Christy, not a question, but I do know that when people are asking about supplies, Ricky Carroll, AKA the Cheese Queen, who started up in Ashfield, is now just bought a building in the last year in Northampton, and I believe is going to have a retail shop as well. So if you look up New England Cheesemaking Supply, if you happen to be in Northampton, I believe she's having a storefront as well.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, she's pretty famous.
Yeah, she is.
So sometimes if I get impatient waiting for the milk to coagulate and I stir it, I don't actually get a chance to cut it with the knife, which is kind of a fun part. But you can stir it as well. So if you end up stirring it and it kind of breaks up the curds, you can just take them out that way rather than cutting it. Just want to try to make sure that you're not ending up with a big glob of curd that hasn't been broken because it reserves a lot of whey in there. You want to kind of cook out a little bit of the whey before you remove them. All right, while we're waiting, I'm gonna show you the rest of this video. If I move the curds from the whey here while that's going on, just know that they coagulated and I'm gonna put them in a strainer and start heating up my whey. So here's a fancy part. If you don't want to waste anything, you can use your leftover whey that you've already heated most of the way to boiling for making ricotta. So we're going to heat that whey up all the way to almost 180, I would say, and add just a little bit more acid. So you already have the citric acid in here, which may be enough if you just heated the whey up to 180 degrees. But I usually add a little bit of white vinegar, so a tablespoon or two, maybe 3 tablespoons at the max, just to encourage anything left, the solids, to separate from the whey. Let it sit at that hot temperature for about 10 minutes, and then strain it. So this can be a little dangerous, pouring really, really hot liquid, and the steam will be really hot. So if you're sensitive, you might want to wear pot holders. You could do it outside, pointed away from you, or just be really careful. So this is like a muslin cloth or a tea towel. You can use cheesecloth, but something really fine, because ricotta that you make from leftover whey, it will have any of the large cheese solids taken out of it already, so the leftover cheese solids will be very, very fine. So you want something that will not allow those fine solids to come through, but does let the whey come through. So you won't get a lot of yield from doing this. If you want a lot of ricotta, I would suggest making it from milk instead of from whey. But this is a nice way to not waste. And then you have a little bit of ricotta you can use for recipes, either cheesecake or lasagna. You can also store it up and keep it in the freezer until you have a whole bunch for a bigger recipe. So use a rubber spatula or something to pull off all the solids from the sides. And there you go. You have a nice little bit of ricotta that you maybe weren't even expecting. Okay, so bonus, we're not actually going to make ricotta tonight, but it is a byproduct of whey if you're interested in making that. So now you know how. I also put together a handout for you. So either Fern or Jesse will put that in the chat just so that you can access the recipe for both mozzarella and ricotta later. While that was going on, I realized that I had put plain water in my milk, which is why it wasn't coagulating. So I did add the rennet, and it seems to be separating now. So I'm going to go ahead and separate the curds from the whey. So I am guilty of double tasking or multitasking while I'm making cheese because there is so much downtime here and there. And as you can tell, it's a really bad idea. So I'll do my best to pay attention to what I'm doing, but it's a good lesson. All right, so we're going to turn up the heat. We're looking for at least 160 degrees on your way. And you just want to make sure you're stirring occasionally while it's heating up, because it will boil over pretty quickly, and it can also scorch on the bottom. So I'll try to show on the demo screen what these curds look like. So they're starting to mat together. Which is a good sign. It's draining into the bowl below, so all the whey is being captured. So I can add that back in and heat it up for ricotta later if I want to. I'll probably give it to my pigs because they love the whey. And I can use milk if I wanted ricotta at any point. The benefit from having dairy animals is you always have milk in the refrigerator or more outside if you need it. But it is a great idea to use anything you can for food. So capturing that whey and not putting it down the drain. You can also use it as a fertilizer. So pouring it onto areas where you'd like to add a little bit of nutrient to your soil. I'm going to go ahead and break our curd into two so that it's ready for putting on the slotted spoon and heating up when it's time. Was there another question?
Yes, somebody would like to know, where can you find milk that isn't ultra pasteurized? And I guess I'll add, raw milk is probably better. Yes, no, does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a raw milk fan for sure. Raw milk makes cheese much easier because there's live enzymes and bacteria in there. But you're right, yeah, you don't want to use ultra pasteurized milk for cheese making. So most organic milk that you can find in the stores has been shipped really far, and they give it a really long shelf life, probably because there's less of a market for organic than conventional, unfortunately. But what that is it's heated up past the point of no return. So it breaks down pretty much anything good in the milk, especially when it comes to cheese making. So if you can avoid organic store-bought milk, you'll probably be okay. I have had some issues with other just plain old pasteurized store-bought milk. So it's not labeled as ultra pasteurized, but I've tried to make cheese from it, and it just doesn't coagulate. It just ends up as like little pieces of rice almost, and they just stay separated. So typically you're going to be okay if you get plain pasteurized milk from the store, but yeah, local raw milk is definitely a safe bet. All right, we're at about 1:55. We're getting close. Anything else I can answer in the next couple minutes?
Nope, seems like everyone's kind of quiet.
Okay.
I have a question. I know that there are a lot of small dairies around, certainly Massachusetts. Are you looking, is all, let's say I get something direct from the farm, raw milk, is it all pretty much the same in terms of fat content, water content? Is that going to affect it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have dairy goats as well as a dairy cow. So their milk is different. So not only is goat milk a little bit, I'll say fragile, but it's a little bit softer when it comes to cheese making. The molecules are smaller. So you can make mozzarella the same way, and sometimes I will mix cow milk and goat milk if I have just enough of both. But the fat content is different in them, the protein content is different. They have different milk solids. So not only is it species specific, but it can be breed specific for cows. So if you're getting regular conventional milk, it's probably from a Holstein, which is going to have very low butter fat and low protein, probably lower yield from 1 gallon of milk than you would get from probably a smaller farm that has a different breed of cow that likely has higher protein and milk solids. So it doesn't really matter for the process, but your yield could certainly be different. Okay, so we're there. We're at 170, so I'm going to go ahead and start heating up one of these balls of curds. And I've turned my heat down so it doesn't keep heating up too much. So it's down at a low level, but not off. And I'm going to try to keep the curds moving around in the way so that it doesn't melt through the spoon like you saw in the demo.
Christy, I have another question. If you're buying store-bought milk, does it matter if it's, I assume it's whole milk versus 2%, 1%? You want full fat, right? Not skim or
Yeah.
anything like that?
You're full of good questions, Fern.
That's my job.
Yeah, so if you're buying mozzarella in the store, you've probably seen it called part skim mozzarella. So you can make mozzarella from skim milk. What you're looking for is the protein in the milk solids rather than the fat, but the fat does add flavor and it adds a different texture. So if you're making mozzarella from skim milk or really low fat milk, it's probably going to be harder, not as stretchy and creamy.
And if you use like cream, like whipping cream, that's too much fat, correct?
Yes, correct.
All right.
Yeah, one thing we talked about in the family cow workshop that Sarah Davis and I did this weekend, when you're selecting your milk or your breed of cow that you are looking for, or your breed of goat, different breeds will be better for different purposes. So, you know, a Jersey cow makes really high butterfat milk, but probably not as much milk solids and maybe too fatty for some cheeses. So if you're looking for really good quality milk for cheese, you might look at something like Normandy, or what are the other good ones? Everyone has their favorites, but you can do some research or talk to your farmer if you're interested in what kind of cows and what quality milk they have.
And one more question. How long can this sit in the refrigerator? Not that it would, but if you happen to make a lot of it or you're going to make a recipe the next day, what's the best way to store it in the refrigerator and how long will it keep?
Yeah, so probably about a week. It's a fresh cheese. It's best when you eat it right away. So it's pretty rare that, you know, if you're making fresh mozzarella, that whole batch goes into the refrigerator, but you probably will have some leftovers. So about a week, I would say keep it in an airtight container in the refrigerator. I've accidentally, or just my multitasking brain forgets to cover it, and I'll just put my finished mozzarella in the refrigerator without any wrap or without it being in a bag or something like that. And it forms this awful leather around it. So it gets really hard and the inside of the cheese will stay moist, but it dries out pretty quickly. So you do want to keep it covered in the refrigerator. It's different than store-bought mozzarella because it doesn't have all those preservatives and anti-caking agents, but it does freeze really well. So in the spring when I have tons of milk and I want to put something away for the winter when I know my cow's going to be dry, I'll make a whole bunch of mozzarella and shred it and freeze it. So put it in a Ziploc bag or another airtight container, shredded, and then we can pull it out and use it for pizza or take little bits out and use it here and there. It melts perfectly that way.
I'm going to share one thing that Lucy shared to us, that NOFA has a raw milk network on their website, and you can locate each licensed dairy in your state of Massachusetts. Thank you, Lucy.
And Lucy is one of those, I believe. Okay, so our curds are about 140 degrees, so that should be good for stretching. So I'm gonna take them out, do a little bit of stretching. Some people like to heat the curds up to around 160 or even 170, which is the temperature of the whey itself. But I found that's a little bit too much because then the cheese gets really runny and it's hard to do anything with at that point. So I look for 135, 140 and see how that goes. You can also break your curds into a smaller mass to manage it and heat it faster. So it is hot. I just said it's 140 degrees, so I'm not going to be using my hands a lot here, but I am going to salt it. I'll try to do a better job than I did on that video of incorporating it. So it does cool down pretty fast. At this point, I'm able to work with it without gloves, but I'm not going to hold on to any certain point too much because it is still hot. So you can see the tearing here. That means it's not quite hot enough. So I'm going to put it back in there, give it a little longer. What shape should we make tonight? Anyone have a suggestion?
I say braid it. Show
Oh,
us your
boy.
skills.
I don't know if I've got enough here, but maybe we could try that. So I do have a couple more slides. While this is getting to the perfect stretchiness, I'm going to share those with you. Okay, so here we are at a... You don't want to watch that again. So troubleshooting. If you're not getting what you think you should be getting, what could be going wrong? One of the big things that I learned is the pH of the milk really matters. So the reason that we add the citric acid is to bring the pH of the milk down. So you want it to become more acidic. You may have a pH in the range of 6 to 6.5 with fresh milk. It can vary quite a bit depending on the age of your milk when you start. So older milk or aged milk will have a lower pH. It'll be more acidic. And that's just because it has natural lactic acid in there, and it's breaking down the bacteria in the milk, turning it into something more acidic. So you will need less citric acid if your milk is older, or if for some reason it's just a different pH to start. That can be affected by the stage in lactation of the milk animal. It could also be if something is wrong with the animal or the milk hasn't been properly stored. So something to think about there. If it's too acidic, like you added too much citric acid, then it's not going to come together. You'll end up with really grainy, non-stretchy curds. So that is not really something you can fix if it gets to be too acidic, but you'll know for next time. And you can check the pH with a pH meter, like the picture on the right there, or you can also use pH strips, but just know that where you're measuring it matters. So if you're measuring your milk, that's one thing, but when you get to the point of curds and whey, you should really be measuring the curds separately from the whey. Because the whey will just continue dropping in acidity while the curds are a little bit more stable. So ideally, once you have changed the acidity of your milk by adding your citric acid, you want it to be around 5.2 to 5.6 before you add your rennet, because that will stabilize it a bit. And for stretching, you want your mozzarella curds to be about 5.2 to 5.4. Some things that can happen too is your mozzarella too hard or too soft. Sometimes that can happen if you've cooked your curds too long. You'll be actually cooking out some of the whey, so that will make your cheese harder. If your cheese is too soft, you may want to actually cook the curds a little bit longer. So with goat milk, I tend to do that because it is a little softer, typically. I'm going to multitask here.
Christy, I have a question. If your curds are too hard, is that the same thing as cheese curds that you put on your French fries? Or is that a whole different process?
Yeah, I actually am not sure what type of cheese they use for those, but yeah, so cheese curds are just cheese that's not finished.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I've actually not tried that. Is it delicious?
There's a local farm here, Thomas Farm, that makes they make cheese curds and they're delicious as a snack. I eat an entire container in one sitting. They're so good. But I don't know what kind of milk she's using. I don't think it's goat milk.
All right, here comes the braiding. Let's see how we do. I should get my daughter to help. She's all into braiding these days. All right, there we are.
Woo! Nice job.
Delicious, good mozzarella. I'm gonna do the second curd later, so you don't have to sit through that. But one other thing to keep in mind, if you are not getting much yield, so you're like, I did everything and there's hardly any cheese from this, you could try adding some calcium chloride to the milk before you start. That's pretty good for pasteurized or store-bought milk. It just helps to, I guess it adds calcium iodes, I think they call it, which can help separate the solids in the milk and give you a higher yield. So the calcium chloride you can get from a cheesemaking supply company, also about 1/4 teaspoon to 1/4 cup of water for every gallon of milk. And you just put that in before you start. And then just the most important thing is that it's supposed to be fun. I've certainly been frustrated by batches that don't work well. And you know, it's part of making your own food is you want to be really proud of what you create and serve it to everyone and have everyone love it, but it doesn't always turn out perfectly. So just remember, if you can, that it's a process and there's more milk out there. Keep trying and hopefully you have fun with it.
Thank you so much, Christy. Is there anybody else who have any questions or thoughts about this? Anybody need to share? I just wish we could have a taste.
I'll save some for you. Anyone wants to come try it.
I'll drive to Barre. Great.
I have a question.
Sure.
I've only made yogurt, so I've never made cheeses, but I've watched enough of these demonstrations all the years. I've got to jump in and do it. Is rennet used in all cheese making?
Not all. So a lot of fresh cheeses, you don't need to use rennet. And actually, I've made mozzarella without rennet before as well. If you get the pH exactly right and it's fresh milk and it's amazing and it just coagulates on its own. But I don't know how to replicate that. But so things like ricotta, you wouldn't need to add rennet, things like chev. But rennet is typically used even in really small amounts for most cheeses. You can do a lactic acid set rather than a rennet set cheese, but
Okay.
it's a little harder.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Well, I want to thank you, Christy, for showing us how to make mozzarella. I hope everybody can dive in and at least give an experiment. And anything else we need to let them know? No. Wait, we got a few new messages here. Hang on. Thank you, Jessie, the workshop survey. Oh, we have another question from Sarah. How much cheese do you get from a gallon?
About a pound of cheese. Good question.
Excellent. So yes, please do the workshop survey. Look at the program book, visit our vendors and our sponsors who keep us going. Lots of great workshops in the next couple of days. So hope to see you there. And if that's all, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. Good luck. Happy cheese making.